I put a fairly provocative sort of title to this, but as you can imagine, we often don't see bruises amongst our clients. And in fact, it just made me reflect about 2 or 3 years ago that if someone had turned up to me and said, you really need to be screening for problem gambling amongst your, at least screening for violence amongst your problem gambling clients, I would have said, no, there's too many other things we have to screen for at the moment, and there's certainly a number of other things I'd prioritise ahead of violence, and that it was just anecdotally didn't seem to be that sort of a person that would be subjected either to receiving violence as a victim or perpetrating violence. But about a year or so ago, we had the Vulnerable Children's Act passed in New Zealand, and that focused on harm to children, and it'd be violence and all the extent of violence, and it requires us to have a policy and it required us to report to the authorities if there's any risk for children. And about 12 months ago, I started looking at violence, and I looked at about 14 articles that have been published. There weren't a lot of articles around, and so I was still thinking, I wonder how this actually applies to problem gambling. I'd read the odd one that said, yes, there seems to be quite a bit there, but in the back of my mind, it didn't embed itself in my head. So I was aware that we were collecting a lot of data from various screens, putting them into the CLIck system, which is our system that we collect the data, and there was nothing there around violence, but we're in the process of reviewing that collection system, and what I'm going to try and put forward today is a case to go and say we should be screening for intimate partner violence. There's a lot of different violence, as you can imagine. In fact, I thought the major violence that I would be involved in, and I certainly came across it quite often, was my gambling clients owing money to loan sharks and not paying it back. And they were often threatened by violence. And I thought that's where the violence fits. But I hadn't thought of it as intimate partner violence. But let's just go through it a little bit. Now, I don't want to teach you to suck eggs, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about what is intimate partner violence, the emotional partner violence. Now, quite often we'd go and look at the second one there and we'd say, all right, that's physical violence is really what we're talking about. Hitting, kicking, beating, slapping, in other words, leaving a bruise. And that's the first thing we seem to think about. But in actual fact, we forget that there's other aspects to violence that can have just as serious impacts and perhaps even worse. Sexual violence, coercive violence around that. And if you look at the one on here, emotional violence. We hear about bullying all the time and the effect it has on our young people on the internet. And we need to understand that that can affect adults as well. So insults, humiliation, we're talking about serious insults, serious humiliation and threats, and often that can be highly correlated with people taking their own lives. And then on the other side, we often look at that as perhaps a misnomer that we shouldn't be putting this down as violence, but controlling behaviour, you've got isolating the partner from their family and from friends, which often happens, monitoring the clients. For example, you'll get some intimate partners that will go and say, you have to tell me where you're going, keep in touch with me by phone, bring back your receipts if you spent any money. There's a lot of that happening. And restricting access, and that's restricting access. For example, a lot of coercive partners will say, you can't have a bank account yourself, you have to go through our bank account, and I've got the withdrawing rights. Or it might be you can't have a job. And I guess in some of the training, I've actually referred back to a client which I thought was atypical that I had probably about 20 years ago. And it was exactly that. She was a young wife who had a gambling problem, and she was with a very coercive, controlling husband who used to lock her up each day when he went to work and took her clothes with him. And for 2 years, she said, I just walked around with a towel around me. And it took her 2 years to actually get out of the window, run next door and ask for help. But it certainly wrecked her life. On and off, I saw her for about another 10 years. She was in and out from problems. They got worse. She was clearly traumatized by this earlier abuse. And it was as harmful as physical abuse. I'm just putting up some of the factors that might be indicated, what might drive some of the intimate partner violence. And what I haven't put there is one of them which I notice is coming out with a lot of publications just recently, and that's where there's a disparity between the rights of males and females. In some cultures, males have far more rights than females, and it appears to be there's a lot more violence and a lot of gambling happening. So there's a lot of gambling happening where the partner has been victimized by someone that says, I should have control. I have a right, cultural right to have control over you. But here's some of the more common ones. These are in the WA World Health Organization website and various other pieces of research. Alcohol and drug use elevates violence. Personality disorders elevates violence. I'll talk a little bit more. You can imagine economic stress is going to elevate stress. Low self-esteem, insecurity, depression, anger control. These are all aspects. What you may notice is many of those particular drivers are elevated amongst problem gamblers. And it's interesting to note. Here's what I've done is I've pulled a lot of information together. You can see I've pulled out of a lot of different pieces of research, and they vary quite widely. So what I've done is I've tended to take an average, which is really not done, but I'm trying to just give you an overview when it comes down to it. So it looks as though it's precise, but it's not. But what you can note is that alcohol there in the general population, about 1 in 8 people will be affected by an alcohol disorder. It's several times. What is that? Probably 5 to 6 times as high amongst problem gamblers. Drug abuse or dependence, 6% in the general population, 38% amongst problem gamblers. Depression, hugely elevated amongst problem gamblers. Anxiety, same again. I've just put 2 personality disorders down there. You can see they're hugely elevated. Personality disorders, as you know, start quite early in life, and that certainly start probably earlier than a person's gambling. So one might say there might be a driver for the gambling problem, one never knows. I'll put down a couple of items there around psychological distress, just show you the stress that a person might be under psychologically and physically. Their health is poor. You can see there that they have 4 times the risk, 4 times the health problems. And smoking, we always know that, but we seem to have poor understanding where smoking fits within problem gambling or addictions and whether or not they moderate other problems. So anecdotally, come back to what I said right at the beginning, that many practitioners, and I was one of them, certainly would see clients and suspect that violence is not one of the issues that I should be focusing upon. I tend to go and see my clients as being quiet, withdrawn, isolated, people that seem to be very cognitive rather than emotional. And I would have thought, all right, maybe violence isn't going to be there unless, of course, they're not repaying money to their loan sharks. On the other hand, when I had a family member in with a gambler, the family member would have all the emotions. And it would be easy to go and start thinking, right, I could see this person losing in a very angry situation, losing their cool and striking the gambler. And I thought that's where there might be some violence, but in many cases I would have thought perhaps the gambler thinks that if I can control my gambling, then the whole risk for problems will reduce, including violence. Okay, let's just start taking stress for a start. Stress is a factor of violence. As you can imagine, stress is very high amongst both family members and problem gamblers for obvious reasons. I've just taken out one aspect of what stress might end up with, and that's suicide rate, a high suicide rate. In DSM-4, it was 20%. 1 in 5 people would attempt suicide. It's dropped slightly, 17.3% in DSM-5. That happens to be exactly the figure we got in our published research in 2006 in 2 papers that we worked with clients that had been admitted to hospital after a suicide attempt. And I'm still rather shocked at those particular figures at the bottom. In Victoria, that for over a period of 12 years, 128 people had gambling-related suicides, and of course 2 of those were in fact the partners of problem gamblers. So high levels of stress, so you can imagine that violence may well be somewhere around there as well. New Zealand Health Survey, which we conduct every 5 years, the last one, 2012, the stress, there was an assessment using the Kessler K10 to find out what the likelihood of having a higher likelihood of depression or anxiety, and it was 4.6% for non-problem gamblers and 28% for moderate and problem gamblers, in other words, 6 times as high amongst them. So one might say, yes, we accept stress in New Zealand, in the New Zealand population, that works very much. So if you look at alcohol abuse, I had those figures before. I've just put up some figures from the Massachusetts Council, which largely round off the same sort of things, which say that 3/4 of problem gamblers will probably be affected by some alcohol disorder. Almost 40% will have some other drug disorder, and 60% nicotine dependent. So we can say that alcohol amongst problem gamblers is a factor. Personality disorders, here's some research by Fontelakis, and they've come up with 4 different personality disorders, 3 cluster B, cluster C as well. So borderline personality disorders where you've got surging moods, uncontrollable moods, antisocial personality disorder, lack of remorse. You can imagine that might be highly correlated with violence. Narcissistic, very self-serving, expectation of acknowledgement again. I could imagine that would fit nicely with problem gambling and with violence, and paranoid personality disorder as well. Where do they fit? Well, I've just highlighted those in pink, and you can see there that it's pretty low. Paranoid personality disorder could be as low as, this is DSM-4 in this particular case, could be as low as 0.5%, and yet in Alex Brzezinski's and Steele's research, it was 40%, really high. And we know that amongst problem gamblers, that they have high levels of personality disorders which are developed from youth. You can see there that antisocial personality disorder, 29%, that is high. And borderline personality disorder, that surge in emotion where violence and reactions can be very sudden, and narcissistic personality disorder. So again, we're hitting a lot of those individual drivers of violence, and we're finding those in problem gamblers. Here's a piece of research, and certainly it's a couple of years old, but basically this Australian research with 115 problem gamblers from a problem gambling treatment service in Australia. And you can see there that over half reported that they were perpetrators of violence in the last year, acknowledged that. And they also said that the gambling generally preceded the family violence. In other words, it might be argued that violence might be a driver for the violence, at least the gambling might be a driver for the violence. And underneath, I've just put a list of who has been perpetrated with the violence, and you've got down there current partners, 1 in 3, 30%. Parents, about the same. I think we forget that aspect. Ex-partners, well, that's surprisingly high as well, 20%. And then children, that'd be affected by our Vulnerable Children's Act. We should be in there. That's quite a high percentage, though, 7%. Extended family, 5%. In other words, 1 in 20 of the gamblers, and siblings, brothers and sisters, 1 in 20. So they're very high. Let's just have a look at females for a start. You can see that 10% of the female problem gamblers acknowledged they were violent with their partner. The interesting one I think we forget is that 25% said, not only was I violent, but I received violence back in return. And I think that's the thing we overlook. And it may be a reason why our clients don't disclose their violence to us. Perhaps they feel guilty about reacting to the violence. Maybe they explained it away saying, I was just defending myself. And you can see that 1 in 3 females who were gamblers were victims of violence from their partner. And from a male's point of view, it was very similar, although it seems remarkably low, but 11% of males said that they were violent with their partners, with their non-gambling partners, and 20% said they were violent with their partners but received violence back. And 7% were simply victims of violence. But if you add the two together, the first 2 circles together, you're getting some substantial numbers. Here's another by Ekateburia, 2013. His research indicates that pathological gamblers were more anxious, impulsive, poor self-esteem. Remember, those are drivers for intimate partner violence. They had a greater history of Axis 1 disorders. We know that, especially anxiety and depression. We know that they're drivers as well. They had, especially the males, more likely to have alcohol problems, another driver. And we've got the 68.6% of females said they were victims of intimate partner violence. And if you add those two circles together, those come out to remarkably similar sort of numbers. So we're not talking about something that's an anomaly. I think we're getting different, perhaps triangulated effect. Here's some more by Dowling, 14 studies that they reviewed and her colleagues. And again, picked up there was a significant relationship between problem gambling and being a victim of intimate partner violence. You can see there are high percentages. Again, that earlier research indicates that those sort of figures are right. Almost 40% in each case being perpetrators or victims. And their research indicated by this study that perpetration of violence, things that drive it are clinical anger. And I don't know about you, but I'm picking up more and more clients that seem to have anger problems that haven't been addressed. They take it as being just part and parcel of what it is, but their inability to have other ways to deal with their anger often means impulsive behaviour, which they explode, and that might be a driver for them to go back and gamble. So you can see there clinical anger, impulsivity, alcohol and drugs, younger age, much more likely to be more abusive if you're a younger person, and underemployment. Not non-employment, but underemployment. And the conclusion there highlights the need for screening for intimate partner violence. And we need to be screening also for these other drivers, which are alcohol and drug, mental health, and we need to provide interventions to manage those coexisting problems. Otherwise, if you're just doing gambling and you're not dealing with the violence and you're not dealing with other coexisting issues, you're going to have a lot of resistance where people are not going to change their behaviour, or they're going to disconnect from treatment, or they're going to relapse. It's one of those three things are likely to happen. I'd like to put a plug here for AUT. I said that first, that was the first arm. This is the second arm, I've just been told, of that research is coming out. There's another part of the research that's in Hong Kong, and the three pieces of research will go and show across cultures what is the impact of violence around problem gambling. And as I mentioned, Maria, mid-year, is it? It's before the referees at the moment, isn't it?
We're just finishing writing it at the moment.
Okay. I think it'd be really good to see that information. It will be hard to avoid it and hard for us to go and say, that's overseas, that's happening in Australia, it doesn't happen in New Zealand, or that's happening in Canada and the likes of that, when we can sheet it home to us. Now, just talking about how can we approach it? Now, I like plugging this screen. It's the chat screen. It was developed by the Department of General Practice for GPs originally, but it's been used broadly across many different social and health providers. And it makes sense, and I'll show you a copy of it in a minute. It's starting to be widely used, not just in New Zealand, but throughout the world. It covers 9 topics with 16 main questions and really takes about 2 minutes to complete. It was designed by GPs that don't have time. So, and it also covers questions that we don't tend to ask clients. It's brief, it's validated for a lot of different cultures, and it's published in many journals. It has screens for depression and many other. Here it is here. Now, just have a look at it. It's free, it's available for everyone. There's more research rolling out. You can see it starts with nice, this is what good screens do. You start with nice, non-confrontational questions. You gradually tack on to the heavier questions, and by then people are freely answering questions. The other thing I'd point out, and I noticed looking at the Cochrane review recently, there are some aspects, there are some particular behaviours that people are less likely to disclose to a counsellor face-to-face and may be more likely to disclose by ticking a box in a screen. That's really interesting. And I think I saw a piece, and I tried to find that article again, where they said that happens with intimate partner violence as well, in which case we need to have some sort of a screen that is appropriate, some sort of question is appropriate. So we can see there, we simply ask about cigarettes, and then we talk about alcohol. Now, these are all validated screens. Each of those blocks are validated screens. That means there's a high likelihood that that will equate to a problem rather than just, but it's simply to raise the question in the first place and to follow up. The next one is non-prescription, in other words, recreational drugs. And then we have a couple of gambling questions that are correlated with, and then we've got a depression screen. This is Wooley's depression screen that's been around for some time. Answer one of any of those, and it would be a high likelihood you would meet the criteria for major depressive disorder. The next one is worry, which is general addiction disorder, the next one, which is probably the most common one. But then here's the violence one, or it's more the victim of violence one. There's not a perpetration question there, but is there anyone in your life whom you're afraid of or hurts you in any way? And is there anyone in your life who controls and prevents you doing what you want? And as we mentioned, those are two aspects of abuse that we need to ask about. And the next one I think is important too. We don't ask our clients around anger. Now these are validated questions. They're not plucked out of the air. They've been tested on many thousands of participants in research. The last one is exercise, which is, I always include in my therapy anyway. We're starting to understand more and more about the benefits of exercise and how it lifts people, lifts depression, how it has biological effects, and how important it is. With functional MRIs, we'll probably know a lot more about this in the future. So what I'm plugging for is we need to be using something like this, not just randomly. If you start screening the clients you suspect might have a problem around violence, then you're going to have a lot of false negatives. You're going to miss a lot of clients because although I started with a presentation saying, you know, where did you get that bruise? In actual fact, you won't be seeing any bruises. It could be any one of those other aspects around violence, and we should take that into account. Interventions, well, we need to screen, but we need to systematically screen. We need to be giving everyone the screen. 5 minutes, thank you. So everyone needs to get the screen, and that way we don't, and it's a real advantage. If you can do that, remember you've got 9 different aspects, I would want to know all about those other 9 aspects in building a treatment plan for a client. I think it's really important. I think we're missing out on a lot of these. Self-esteem is really important with both victims and perpetrators. So don't assume that just because a person is a perpetrator that they have high self-esteem. They might with certain personality disorders, but even narcissistic personality disorders are very fragile. Identify goals. That's a good way for people. I'd certainly put to my clients, I go and say, if I found that there was some violence involved, I'd say, is that the person you see yourself as? And quite often they would say, no, the worst thing that could happen is my children see me being violent, or it's not someone I want to model to anyone, certainly not my children again, or I value the relationship and I just lose my control, the likes of that. So again, if you can work with their goals and say, what would you like to be? How does your behavior at the moment fit? How important is it to change it? And again, motivate people to think how they might be without these problems in the future. That sort of magic question we used in solution-focused narrative therapy. And also work within the readiness to change paradigm. So again, that takes into account what personality disorders you may be working with. Don't assume that because you're working with a person with antisocial personality disorder, they're going to feel remorse, or a person with narcissistic personality disorder is going to be more focused on their partner rather than themselves. Work within that restraint. The other thing we should be aware of is why people may not disclose that they are victims of violence, and also why they don't simply leave a relationship. Here's some of the reasons. I mean, we do have a cycle of, that's one of the models, cycle of violence, and you probably have the same sort of situation where after a violent episode where a partner may be struck, and it's usually a she, but not always. I've certainly had males that have been violently attacked and struck and, stabbed by their partners. But in many cases, it's a relief. For a while there's a make-up time after the violence when they just feel that I don't have to be afraid, and it just feels really good. And then they can often feel that the tension is starting to build up, and then they'll actually precipitate the tension because they can't stand the tension any longer, and the violence occurs, and then they'll blame themselves for bringing on the violence. And the cycle just keeps on going. But here we've just got some of the other things, fear of retaliation, lack of alternative money. In other words, if I leave, how am I going to look after myself? Concern for the children. Lack of social support. Remember, if they've been isolated from everyone, they're thinking, I've got no one to help me. Stigma, losing custody. Now, I've certainly had that a lot where partners have said, you're never going to see the kids. I'm going to go to the family court. I'm going to tell you you've spent all the money. You're going to, the kids will starve if you're looking after, so I don't want to, you're not going to get near the children. Love and hope for change, well, that's part of that abuse cycle. Often they think they can change the problem gambler in many cases, or the abuser, should I say, abused person. So just to round up in the last couple of slides, beware of the high risk of violence amongst problem gamblers, violence, receiving violence, and perpetration of violence. So victim and perpetrator, and in many cases both. So I'd certainly address both. That seems to be the largest likelihood, doesn't it? Symptoms aren't always overt by any means, but we're dealing with problem gamblers whose behaviour isn't overt anyway. The clients may be both, victims and perpetrators. Try using the chat. You have to disclose imminent harm, and that's quite apart from harm to children. You know, your obligation is to head off imminent harm, and sometimes it's very, very serious harm we're doing. So because I haven't got much time, I've gone through that already. Look at underlying issues, it's important. Depression, anxiety. Look at anger management. Have some strategies. I'm always handing up practice things for clients to do because they often say, yeah, I want to deal with my anger. I can blame it on my anger. If I can deal with my anger, I'm not going to be violent. And there are good strategies that are well known that work well. So summary is have a policy in your work that addresses intimate partner violence. That means ask about it in various ways, but do it systematically. Don't rely on you're being able to spot the symptoms. It's not always. Providing engagement. These are people who often feel guilty around it. Also, remember there might be, for some gamblers, the belief that they've brought it on themselves. So as far as they're concerned, they might get relief actually from being punished. Certainly you've probably all had clients, and before I used to get clients that used to hit their heads against walls to punish themselves for their gambling and losing all their money. This might be another way that they can say, well, it's my fault, I brought it on, and I don't want to address that. Explaining that violence is a common issue, I think that normalise, not violence, but normalise the fact that it's prevalent and that it's an issue that needs to be addressed. And when you approach the addressing the intimate partner violence, don't do it as a separate thing. Do it as an integrated approach with the other drivers that are happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. I found that very interesting, a really good summary of the research that's there and the treatment strategies and things. And I'd like to plug for our research as well, of course. We have time for one question. If anybody has a question.
Who is the next speaker?
We do have one question.
Yes. Hi.
I think you alluded to it, but can you explain why it is that you got into this? I mean, I don't think people would normally think about violence when they're talking about problem gambling. But is this an area that you've been dealing with before domestic?
No. It's relatively new. In fact, I feel somewhat guilty that it's taken me so long to actually click to the idea. You know, I've been working with problem gamblers for 25 years, and I started doing more work with clients with alcohol and drug problems and anger issues and violence, and I thought that was a difference between gambling. It's when the Vulnerable Children's Act came out and I started doing a bit more research, I realised the high prevalence, and I realised that I'd been overlooking. I hadn't been asking, and people don't necessarily want to tell me about it. They don't see the relevance. So as help providers, we should be asking about it, but making it safe enough so people can talk. They often feel so embarrassed that they've put up with it for so long. They're often so embarrassed that they've been violent. But the difficulty is working with people with a high level of personality disorders as well, because you can often feel as though they won't have any insight at some stage. So you can still find goals that they will change their behaviour, their violent behaviour, not because of their remorse, but because it works for them not to get into trouble.